This lecture is part of the West Indian Soldier Heritage Project, carried out in partnership with the National Army Museum and the National Lottery Heritage Fund.
The West India Regiments, the Anglo-Shanti Wars. Towards the end of the 18th century, Napoleon's France was becoming increasingly problematic for British colonial interests in the Caribbean. A locally raised force was deemed necessary to curb this threat and secure the British West Indies. It was proposed that this force be drawn from the population of enslaved labourers who were forced to work on plantations owned by British colonists. However, resistance from these colonists saw the British Army turn to the transatlantic slave trade in order to purchase enslaved Africans to man their new regiments. After the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, the British Army continued to recruit these West African men to the West India Regiments. The prevailing wisdom at the time was that African men and West Indians were more capable of withstanding tropical diseases that had been such a problem for Europeans over the centuries. Moreover, their effectiveness in suppressing uprisings of enslaved people and ability to combat guerrilla warfare in tropical environments impressed the powers that be. Together, these factors were behind the expansion of the West India Regiments, and at the height of their strength, they boasted 12 regiments. Although the name might suggest that these regiments were used exclusively in the British West Indies, they were also stationed across West Africa, noticeably in Sierra Leone and on the Gold Coast. Their service was important for the achievement of Britain's colonial ambitions in Africa and helped them achieve much of their empire's territorial expansion. Throughout the 19th century, there were recurring conflicts between the British and the Ashanti in what is today Ghana, as the two vied for dominance of the Gold Coast area. The West India regiments played a large role in these first conflicts, but as the century progressed, their influence waned, and they became less central in the later campaigns. The Ashanti were a powerful group in the Gold Coast area, and they derived much of their strength from the supply of valuable materials to Europeans, which included gold, ivory, and enslaved Africans. The Ashanti Empire was largely landlocked, with little direct access to the coast. As such, they had to rely on the Fanti, a group located on the coast, to act as middlemen between themselves and the Europeans they sought to trade with. As a result, before the 19th century, they were largely subservient to the Fanti, who were the dominant African power in the Gold Coast area. Founded in the late 17th century by King Osei Tutu, rapid military expansion had united the Ashanti under the symbol of the golden stool, which you can see in the centre of the Ashanti flag to the left. It is suggested that the name Ashanti reflects their military aptitude, as it literally means because of war. In 1806, the Ashanti drew on this military capability, invading Fanti territory, thus becoming the dominant power in the area, and ensuring that they no longer had to rely on the Fanti to facilitate their trade with European powers. This newfound power meant that they were to butt heads with the British throughout the 19th century as they sought to resist British expansionism and encroachment into their land. Several locations that are important to understanding the course of the Anglo-Shanti Wars during the 19th century are shown here in this map. Kumasi, the capital of Ashanti territory, would be the target of British expeditions in the 3rd, 4th and 5th Anglo-Ashanti Wars. On the coast, Elmina and Cape Coast were important bases of European colonial control from the 17th century through to the 19th century. Prior to the 1870s, Elmina had been administered by the Dutch since 1656, when the Treaty of Boutra was signed by the Dutch and the Ashanti. This afforded the Ashanti some semblance of connection to the coast, thus laying the groundwork for later hostilities between the British and the Ashanti in the latter 19th century, when the Ashanti lost their access to the coast and the financial strength they derived from it. Cape Coast had been controlled by the British since 1664, after they seized it from the Dutch. The area had historically been controlled by the Ashanti's local rival, the Fanti. Initially, the British paid rent to the Fanti for use of the site, but as the power of the Fanti waned due to the rise of the Ashanti, they became increasingly aligned with the British. Due to this, the Ashanti and the British interest in the Gold Coast area became increasingly aligned to the issue of territory and access to and control of the coast. The River Pra, which is here highlighted by the curved orange line, effectively demarcated the boundaries of Ashanti and Fanti territory, which was latterly the British Protectorate. Incursions into the territory south of the river by the Ashanti typically signalled the beginning of military conflicts. After the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, British interest in the Gold Coast area changed, and this necessitated the creation of a treaty with the Ashanti. After failures to properly enforce this treaty, the Asante Hene, the leader of the Ashanti, ordered his army to cross the Pra and invade Fanti territory. In response to this, the British governor, Sir Charles Macarthy, led a contingent of British troops, including troops from the West India Regiments, to meet the Ashanti. However, these forces were ambushed, leading to the death of Charles Macarthy at the Battle of Asankow in late January 1824. After a month of skirmishing in February, the British established outposts along the River Pra. As a brief stalemate set in, the role of the West India troops was largely limited to outpost duty, with only a few minor skirmishes. However, in April, when this impasse subsided, the British troops began to retreat back towards the coast, allowing the Ashanti to advance. During this retreat, the British were engaged in a conflict with the Ashanti at the Battle of Bula on the 21st of April 1824. According to reports, the locally raised forces, which consisted largely of Fanti soldiers, disbanded quickly at the beginning of the 5-hour-long conflict, leaving West Indian troops to defend their encampment. After this battle, the British forces were able to retreat to Cape Coast. However, the Ashanti forces established camps near the British fortress and began to advance on the 11th of July. Despite the supposed numerical inferiority of British forces garrisoned at Cape Coast, the British were able to effectively drive the Ashanti away. In the image below, the British forces seem to consist largely of white European soldiers. However, of the 285 British troops involved in this conflict, 90 were from the 2nd West India Regiment. Prior to the arrival of a large contingent of locally raised soldiers the next day on the 12th of July, a large proportion of the British forces that were able to successfully resist the Ashanti were from West India. In the maintenance of this key centre of British control on the Gold Coast, West Indian troops were therefore crucial. Over the course of the next few decades, the British continued to increase their dominance of the Gold Coast area south of the River Pra. In the 1850s, the British even introduced a levy of 1 shilling per person who lived in what was by now the British Protectorate. Resenting this dominance, the Ashanti once again crossed the River Pra and invaded the British Protectorate, thus beginning the Second Anglo-Shanti War. However, as with the First Anglo-Shanti War, the British forces were not able to pose an effective opposition to the Ashanti and were unable to prevent their initial skirmishes. The time of year drastically changed the shape of the war, with the prevalence of tropical diseases during the unhealthy season seriously hampering preparations to lead an expedition against the capital of Ashanti territory, Kumasi. Consequently, the role of the West India Regiments in this conflict was severely limited, with the only opportunity for service coming in the shape of outpost duty. Colonel James Caulfield, who was a sub-lieutenant in the 2nd West India Regiment at the time of the Third Anglo-Shanti War in the 1870s, said of the West Indian troops' service, the duties were most arduous, the detachment being during the unhealthy season constantly on outpost duty on the borders of the Protectorate. The exemplary service of the West India soldiers garnered special mention from Lieutenant Colonel Pine, who was the commanding officer of soldiers on the Gold Coast during this conflict, stating that he appreciated the conduct of the men under circumstances of peculiar difficulties, privations, and hardships, which I witnessed with sorrowful admiration. Whilst the West India regiments were prevented from active service against the Ashanti in this conflict, their service was recognised, and they were lauded for their conduct. At this point in the 19th century, the star of the West India regiments remained high, and as we have seen, their contributions to the colonial ambitions of Britain were readily acknowledged. However, over the course of the next few decades and the forthcoming conflicts with the Ashanti, their role would be diminished. In the early 1870s, the British purchased all Dutch holdings on the Gold Coast, assuming control of their forts, including at Elmina. Under Dutch control, the port of Elmina had been an important source of access to the sea and trade with European powers for the Ashanti. However, the loss of this avenue compounded the loss of influence that the Ashanti had suffered as other Gold Coast powers in the Protectorate, namely the Fanti, became increasingly aligned with the British over the course of the 19th century. As a result, the Asantehene ordered his soldiers to cross the Pra and secure access to the sea by taking control of Elmina from the British. Accordingly, the Ashanti crossed the Pra and established a camp which was 100 miles from both Elmina and Cape Coast, providing them with a platform to challenge these two crucial centres of British colonial authority on the Gold Coast. To deal with the threat posed by the Ashanti, the British cleared large parts of Elmina in which people who were thought to be loyal to the Ashanti lived. This also had the effect of clearing large tracts of land, which would make the defence of the port settlement more effective. Indeed, in June 1873, when a force of some 2,000 Ashanti soldiers came to attack the British at Elmina, the E Company of the 2nd West India Regiment was able to use the newly cleared land to their advantage, thus repelling the Ashanti. On the subject of this action, Colonel James Caulfield wrote that the West India soldiers charged the enemy with such spirit that they drove them back, killing a large number. In this first encounter between the British and the Ashanti, West Indian soldiers were crucial to the maintenance of British authority. Over the course of July, when an Ashanti force of reportedly 12,000 soldiers continued to threaten the fort at Elmina, West India soldiers were crucial to holding them at bay through a series of small skirmishes which disrupted the Ashanti campaign. In the previous Anglo-Shanti Wars in the 1860s, the British had not had the opportunity to launch their campaign against the Ashanti, and as such the capacity for West Indian soldiers to demonstrate their military prowess was limited. However, in the defence of Elmina, the efforts of the West Indian troops were central to the maintenance of British colonial authority on the Gold Coast. After this initial phase of the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, General Sir Garnet Wolseley was announced as the new commander of British forces in the Gold Coast in December 1873. As a result of his control, this conflict is sometimes referred to as the First Kumasi Expedition, as Wolseley was tasked with leading a British expedition and putting an end to the Ashanti threat by seizing their capital. However, Wolseley believed that the only way to successfully achieve this target was to employ European soldiers as his primary military component of his expeditionary force. As a result of this, the West India Regiments were relegated from a fighting force, and instead coming to serve as carriers, transporting supplies along the hastily constructed road to Kumasi. At the conclusion of the Third Anglo-Shanti War, General Wolseley commented that he wishes to convey to the soldiers of the 1st and 2nd West India Regiments his appreciation of their soldier-like qualities, and of the manner they had performed their duties during the recent campaign. Colonel Caulfield mirrored these sentiments when he wrote that the action of the men as carriers on their part had a most important influence on the future of the campaign. In this new role, the West Indian troops had been crucial to the success of the campaign. However, whilst the role of West Indian troops was largely limited to transportation duties, there were instances when they continued to demonstrate their abilities as a military force. On one occasion, when the British forces pursued the Ashanti, who had retreated back across the River Pra, they were encircled by the Ashanti, and the British forces were sent into disarray. When they retreated, the West India regiments were able to secure the retreat as a rearguard and ensure the safe return of the British soldiers. Whilst the bottom image here does not necessarily depict this action directly, it does demonstrate how the West India regiments stood and protected those who were retreating from the advance of the Ashanti. On another occasion, Privates Lewis and Fagan volunteered to go on a reconnaissance mission to ascertain the whereabouts of the Ashanti after they had retreated behind the River Bra. On this action, G. A. Henty, who was a special correspondent for the Standard, wrote that this feat appears to me to be one of the most courageous, if not the most courageous, which was performed during the whole campaign. Indeed, Fagan and Lewis's actions saw them win medals for distinguished conduct in the field in 1875 after the end of the campaign, along with several other West Indian soldiers. At the time, the Third Anglo-Shanti War was held up as a model of how white European soldiers could be used effectively in tropical territories to achieve the colonial ambitions of Britain. In this narrative and subsequently, the role of the West India Regiments has largely been thought of merely as a transportation group, simply facilitating General Wolseley's use of European soldiers. However, the actions of the West India Regiments as a rearguard and those of Privates Lewis and Fagan are less commented on. The obscurity of these actions is mirrored by the fact that when the British Expeditionary Forces finally reached Kumasi, only a handful of West Indian troops entered, with the rest of the West India regiments denied access to the Ashanti capital. On this, Colonel Caulfield wrote that the regiment which had borne the brunt of the campaign for over 8 months were not allowed to participate in the honour of entering it, Kumasi. The regiments deserved better luck than they got on this occasion. However, perhaps this was more than just an unlucky moment, as over the course of the last 2 Anglo-Shanti conflicts and the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the West India regiments became increasingly less prominent in the plans of the British Army, despite their exemplary service in the preceding decades. In the final 2 Anglo-Ashanti Wars, the role of the West India Regiments was drastically reduced. At the height of their powers there had been 12 West India Regiments, but by the 1890s there was only 1 remaining West India Regiment, due to the merging of the 1st and 2nd West India Regiments in 1888. In the 4th Anglo-Ashanti War, which, following on from the tradition of the 3rd Anglo-Ashanti War, is sometimes called the 2nd Kumasi Expedition, the forces used by the British Army comprised mostly of British troops and locally raised forces like the House Constabulary. In the 5th Anglo-Shanti War, which is also called the 3rd Carmassi Expedition, this trend continued, with the bulk of British forces comprising of British troops and again of locally raised forces, leaving the sole remaining West India Regiment unused. This decline in their usage went hand in hand with the diminishment of their reputation. At the beginning of the 19th century, they had been highly revered as a fighting force, able to fulfill British colonial ambitions in tropical territories where white European soldiers were highly susceptible to tropical diseases. However, after this final Anglo-Ashanti conflict, Colonel James Willock, who had served in the 4th Anglo-Ashanti War, stated in 1904 that I am convinced you will never get their proper value out of them so long as they are treated in the same way as Europeans. Ultimately, the fate of the West India regiments during the Ashanti Wars can be viewed as a summation of their trajectory within the British Army during the 19th century more broadly. They had demonstrated their ability to further Britain's colonial ambitions, both militarily and logistically, both of which were amply showcased in the Third Anglo-Ashanti War in the 1870s. Despite this, the role of the West India regiments continued to be overlooked, and their status as important imperial forces was diminished.
For more information about this topic, as well as the history and heritage of the Caribbean and the work of the West India Committee, please visit us at westindiacommittee.org. Thank you.